Hidden behind steel doors lie the greatest stories the auto world forgot. From factory wars to near-death legends, this is Vaulted Wheels, unlocking the machines that built America.
Picture this for a second. It's the early 1900s in rural America. Now, we usually have this incredibly romanticized vision of the open sky frontier, right? But the reality for millions of people was actually a life of claustrophobic, muddy, absolute isolation. A simple trip to the nearest market town wasn't just running an errand. It was a grueling, day-long odyssey by horse and wagon. You were stuck. But then, in 1918, a farmer's wife from Georgia writes a letter to Henry Ford, and she includes this simple, profoundly emotional message. You know, Henry, your car lifted us out of the mud. It brought joy into our lives. That one single sentence, it perfectly captures an entire global revolution.
Welcome to this explainer, the machine that built the modern world. Today, we are diving headfirst into the dramatic, incredibly fast-paced story of how one man's absolute, ruthless obsession with mass production utterly annihilated human isolation and permanently rewired the planet we live on. To truly understand the magnitude of this shift, we have to look at the harsh reality of the year 1900. If you were born on a farm back then, your entire existence, the whole world as you knew it, was typically confined to a 5-mile radius. And why 5 miles? Well, because that was the maximum distance a horse could walk and comfortably return in a single day. Think about that. That invisible 5-mile boundary dictated literally everything. It dictated who you met, where you traded, and who you married. You were utterly locked into your immediate geography. There was no escape. But, and here's the fascinating part, the solution to all that isolation didn't actually start with cars. It started with a spectacular failure involving exactly 30 cents. See, in his youth, Henry Ford had this massive obsession with consumer horology, watches. He wanted to mass-produce a pocket watch that he could sell for just 30 cents. He crunched the numbers and calculated he'd need to build 500,000 watches a year just to hit that insanely low price point. Now, he ended up abandoning the idea entirely, but the core philosophy became permanently locked into his brain. Immense production volume creates entirely brand new markets out of thin air. And that grand philosophy brings us right down to the gritty, oily reality of the factory floor in 1913. Because this was not an overnight success story. Ford and his trusted production superintendent, P.E. Martin, spent these grueling, exhausting Sundays just experimenting. They started small. They took sub-assemblies like the magnetos and tried to figure out a completely wild concept. How do we move the work past the men, rather than having the men constantly moving around the work? That early experimentation quickly built into a brutal but absolutely brilliant logic. Ford shifted his operations to this massive, custom-built facility in Highland Park, Michigan. It was designed by the architect Albert Kahn, and it was nicknamed the Crystal Palace because of its massive, sprawling glass windows. And inside those glass walls, they executed 3 ruthless steps that changed manufacturing forever. 1, bring the work to the man. 2, subdivide the labor so minutely that a worker only does one highly repetitive task all day long. And 3, automate the pace using a continuously moving chain. To really feel the impact of this, we have to look at the before picture. Before this moving assembly line, building a single car chassis was a painstakingly slow, craftsman-like process. It took 12.5 agonizing hours to put just one chassis together. It was slow, it was incredibly expensive, and it fundamentally kept the automobile as nothing more than an exclusive luxury toy for the ultra-rich. But when that moving assembly line roared to life, that 12.5-hour build time didn't just drop, it plummeted. 93 minutes, in just over an hour and a half, a complete chassis rolled right off the line. The dizzying, relentless speed of this manufacturing revolution sent absolute shockwaves through the global industrial complex. Almost overnight, Ford was suddenly producing more cars than all other U.S. automakers combined. And as that assembly time just evaporated, the economic payoff was immediate. When the Model T launched in 1908, it started at a respectable $850. But by the 1920s, the ruthless, grinding efficiency of the Crystal Palace had driven the price down to an unbelievable $260. For the very first time in human history, Ford achieved his ultimate vision, a motor car for the great multitude. An average, everyday working family could finally afford one. But as with any massive leap forward, every revolution has a dark side. The human cost of the moving assembly line was, frankly, devastating. The intensely repetitive, mind-numbing nature of that subdivided labor, combined with the dictatorial, unrelenting pace of the automated conveyor belt, literally ground workers down into the dirt. Burnout wasn't just common, it was rampant. Employee turnover got so massive that Ford had to hire over 50,000 men in a single year just to maintain a baseline workforce of 14,000. Think about that ratio. The very machine he had built was on the verge of breaking his entire company. Faced with the total, imminent collapse of his workforce, Ford executed a shocking, history-making countermove in January 1914. He doubled the average worker's wages overnight to an absolutely unheard of $5 a day. The entire business world called him crazy. They thought he was going to bankrupt himself. But it worked. The turnover stopped instantly, and tens of thousands of men flocked to Detroit just for the chance to work in his factories. But here's where the story takes a profound societal twist. By simply trying to stop his workforce from quitting, Ford inadvertently changed the world again. Paying a true living wage meant that his own factory workers could now actually afford those $260 cars they were building. Almost entirely by accident, Henry Ford bought the modern American middle class and birthed the consumer economy exactly as we know it today. The results of all this? Absolute, total dominance. By the early 1920s, if you looked at a road anywhere on the entire globe, there was a staggering probability you were looking at a Model T. Ford's factories were pumping out over half the cars on planet Earth. He hadn't just succeeded, he had completely, undeniably cornered the global market. And of course, they were all the exact same car. You've likely heard the famous quote, right? That you could have a car in any color so long as it's black. But let's debunk a huge modern myth right here and now. Ford didn't have some moody, artistic obsession with the color black. The truth was purely, ruthlessly industrial. Black carbon enamel was simply the only paint chemically capable of drying fast enough to keep up with the furious, terrifying pace of his assembly line. Literally, time was money, and black was the fastest color. As these millions of black Model Ts flooded the country, they permanently, irreversibly reshaped the physical American landscape. They fueled the Good Roads movement because, naturally, rural voters started demanding an end to the mud pits they'd been trapped in. But even more staggeringly, research shows that the affordable automobile, paired with those rising incomes, accounts for a whopping 60% of post-war suburbanization. The car literally pulled people out of dense, crowded city centers, laying down the concrete groundwork for the car-dependent suburbs, gas stations, and roadside motels we see everywhere today. But as America grew wealthier and the roads got better, Ford's stubborn one-size-fits-all philosophy began to rot from the inside. Enter Alfred P. Sloan and General Motors. This right here is the great corporate showdown of the era. GM looked at Ford's rigid, unwavering standardization and launched a lethal counteroffensive based on something completely new, dynamic variety. GM's strategy was nothing short of a psychological masterclass. They didn't just sell one utilitarian black car. No, they offered a brand ladder. You start with a cheap Chevrolet, you move up to a Buick as you get more successful, and eventually you make it to a Cadillac. They offered vibrant, exciting colors. They allowed people to buy cars on credit. And most destructively to Ford's empire, Sloan pioneered planned obsolescence. He actually convinced consumers they needed to replace their perfectly good car simply because a slightly restyled new model year had just arrived in the showroom. Ford arrogantly refused to adapt to this new reality, and the consequences were catastrophic. By the mid-1920s, his sales totally collapsed as consumers flocked over to GM. Forced to finally face reality, Ford did the unthinkable in May of 1927. He shut down his entire production empire for 6 months. Not a single car rolled off the line while he frantically tore down and retooled his factories for the brand new Model A. This shutdown was so incredibly massive, it temporarily rocked the entire U.S. economy. Ford eventually stabilized his company, but his final years are defined by this deep, haunting irony. The man who violently yanked humanity out of the horse-drawn era actually grew to despise the noisy, hyper-mechanized world he had created. He spent millions of dollars building Greenfield Village, which was this idealized, serene 19th century agrarian replica. He had literally put the world on wheels, but his own soul longed for the quiet, muddy isolation his own invention had utterly destroyed. We so often summarize his entire legacy with that famous quote, "If I had asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse." But modern researchers diving into his personal jot books have proven he never actually said it. It is entirely a myth. And yet, the quote survives perfectly, doesn't it? Because it captures the dictatorial aura of a man who never once asked the public what they wanted. He simply forged his own vision of the future in iron and forced the rest of us to live inside it.
Which brings us to the ultimate question. Today, every single time you merge onto a massive interstate highway, or navigate the winding streets of a sprawling suburb, or pull into a drive-thru for a coffee, you are interacting with a physical world engineered by the legacy of the Model T and that Highland Park assembly line. We don't just drive cars anymore. Our entire society is fundamentally structured around them. So as you go about your day to day, look at the streets around you and ask yourself, are we all just passengers, quietly riding along in Henry Ford's world?